When you think of the 1960s, what comes to mind? Probably peace, love, and revolution, right? It's the decade of Woodstock, the Beatles, and Neil Armstrong taking that one small step onto the moon. It felt like a time of incredible optimism, with a whole generation pushing for a better, more harmonious world. But just beneath the surface of all that peace and love, a dark and violent crime wave was washing over the United States, leaving a trail of fear and shattering the country's sense of security. And this wasn't just a blip in the statistics, it was a deep shift in the American mindset. Between 1960 and 1970, the violent crime rate in the US actually more than doubled. It felt like the very fabric of society was coming apart, as a new type of crime started to appear, one that felt more random, more brutal, and way too close to home. This violent undercurrent created a widespread fear that changed how people lived, where they chose to live, and how they saw the world right outside their front door. Today, we're counting down the 5 crimes that really defined the 1960s. These aren't just tragic stories. These are the cases that ripped through the peace and love image and showed everyone the dark side of the swinging 60s, forever changing how America thought about safety and innocence. Kicking off our list isn't some criminal mastermind or a huge conspiracy. Instead, it's a crime that became a chilling symbol of big city apathy. This is a case that forced America to take a long, hard look in the mirror and ask a really uncomfortable question. Are we supposed to look out for each other? This is the story of Catherine "Kitty" Genovese, and how her death in the early morning of March 13, 1964, introduced a terrifying new phrase into our vocabulary: the bystander effect. Kitty Genovese was a 28-year-old bar manager living in Kew Gardens, a quiet neighborhood in Queens, New York. She was independent, well-liked, and felt safe in her own community. Around 3:15 a.m., after a late shift, she parked her car and started the short walk to her apartment. She had no idea she was being watched. A man named Winston Mosley, a 29-year-old family man, was out looking for a victim. He saw Kitty and he picked her. As she got close to her building, Mosley attacked, stabbing her twice in the back. Kitty screamed, "Oh my God, he stabbed me! Please help me!" Her cries cut through the night, and lights started flicking on in nearby apartments. One man, Robert Moser, yelled from his window, "Let that girl alone." This startled Mosley, who got in his car and drove off. Kitty, hurt but alive, stumbled toward the back of her building, out of sight. That should have been the end of it. Someone should have come to help, but nobody came down. Nobody called the police. For about 10 minutes, Kitty lay bleeding in a hallway. Mosley, figuring out that no cops were coming, returned. He calmly searched the apartment complex until he found her, barely conscious, in a locked vestibule. There, he attacked her again, stabbing her, raping her, and stealing $49. The whole nightmare, from start to finish, lasted over half an hour. By the time a neighbor finally did call the police, it was too late. Kitty Genovese was dead. The crime was brutal, but what really shook the nation came 2 weeks later. The New York Times ran a bombshell article with the headline, "37 Who Saw Murder, Did UN Call the Police?" The story, which we now know had some major exaggerations, painted a picture of a cold, uncaring city where dozens of people just watched a woman die and did nothing. One neighbor was quoted as saying he didn't want to get involved. That phrase became a source of national shame. Now, later investigations showed that the number of people who actually saw what was happening was much smaller than 38, and that the whole situation was a lot more confusing than the newspaper reported. But the story had already taken hold. The Kitty Genovese case tapped into a growing fear that our cities were becoming anonymous places, where no one cared about their neighbors anymore. It wasn't just about crime going up, it was about the death of basic human decency. The case gave birth to the bystander effect, a psychological theory that says the more people who are around during an emergency, the less likely it is that any one person will step in to help. Psychologists, inspired by the case, ran studies showing that we all tend to assume someone else will do something, a phenomenon they call diffusion of responsibility. So, the murder of Kitty Genovese became more than just another homicide statistic. It was a cultural wake-up call that sparked a national conversation about our responsibility to each other. Whether the original story was completely accurate or not, it left a deep scar on the American psyche haunting reminder of what can happen when good people do nothing. On August 1st, 1966, a new and uniquely American horror was born on a sunny college campus in Austin, Texas. This was a crime that didn't fit any of the old categories. It wasn't a robbery, it wasn't a crime of passion, and it wasn't a targeted hit. It was random, impersonal, and broadcast live to a terrified nation. This was the day Charles Wittmann, a 25-year-old student and former Marine, climbed the famous University of Texas Tower and began a 96-minute siege, committing what is now seen as the first modern mass shooting in U.S. history. The violence actually started hours earlier. At home, Wittmann, an Eagle Scout and expert marksman, murdered his wife Kathleen as she slept. Then he drove to his mother's apartment and killed her too. In a suicide note he left behind, he wrote about having many unusual and irrational thoughts and crushing headaches, and he asked for an autopsy to see if there was a physical reason for his violent urges. After that, he gathered an arsenal. He packed a footlocker with rifles, handguns, and hundreds of rounds of ammo, along with food and water, like he was preparing for a long standoff. Dressed in a janitor's uniform to blend in, he wheeled the trunk into the university's main building, took the elevator up, and lugged his gear to the observation deck. His public rampage began there. He killed the receptionist, then a family of tourists who tried to come onto the deck. After barricading the door, Wittmann stepped outside, 231 feet above the ground. Around 11:48 a.m., he aimed his rifle over the edge and fired his first shot. His target was an 18-year-old student named Claire Wilson, who was 8 months pregnant. The bullet struck her, killing her unborn baby. Her boyfriend was killed with the next shot as he tried to help her. For the next hour and a half, Wittmann fired down on the people below, turning the campus into a war zone. Students and professors scrambled for cover as bullets rained down from the sky. The police were totally unprepared. They had no idea how to handle something like this. Their pistols were useless against a sniper so high up. The response was a chaotic, improvised effort, with cops and even armed citizens firing back from the ground, just trying to keep him distracted. The whole thing was broadcast on live radio and TV, bringing the horror straight into people's living rooms. Finally, a small group of 3 police officers and 1 civilian made their way up to the observation deck. They rushed the barricaded door, and officers Ramiro Martinez and Houston McCoy confronted Wittmann, shooting and killing him. His reign of terror had lasted 96 minutes. In total, Wittmann killed 15 people that day, including his wife, his mother, and the unborn child, and wounded 31 others. The aftermath was just shock and disbelief. An autopsy did find a small brain tumor, which some experts think might have pressed on a part of his brain related to emotion and aggression. But that was little comfort. The UT Tower shooting was a deep trauma for the country. It destroyed the idea that public spaces were safe and created the stereotype of the lone, seemingly normal guy who just snaps and commits mass murder. This event was a turning point. It led to the creation of new police tactics and the very first SWAT teams. But the cultural impact was even bigger. It introduced a terrifying new kind of violence, one that wasn't about greed or passion, but about some unknowable rage. It dialed up the growing anxiety in America, the feeling that the world was getting more dangerous and that tragedy could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. Some crimes aren't defined by how many people died, but by who was targeted and the shockwaves they send through a country. On April 4th, 1968, on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, a single gunshot silenced the most powerful voice of the civil rights movement. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't just the murder of a man, it was an attack on a dream. It was an act of violence that tore open the nation's racial wounds and triggered one of the darkest periods of social unrest in its history. Dr. King, the 39-year-old Nobel laureate who preached nonviolence, was in Memphis to support a sanitation workers' strike. He was standing on the balcony of his motel room, room 306, just chatting with friends down in the courtyard. At 6:01 p.m., the crack of a rifle shot echoed through the air. A bullet hit King in the jaw, and he collapsed instantly. An hour later, at a nearby hospital, Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. News of his death ignited a firestorm of grief and rage. Riots broke out in more than 100 cities across the country, from Washington, D.C. to Chicago. For days, the nation watched its cities burn. a gut-wrenching expression of the anger and despair felt by millions. The murder of the man who preached peace had unleashed an incredible wave of violence, exposing the deep divisions simmering just below the surface of American life. The hunt for the killer was one of the biggest in FBI history. The key piece of evidence was a bundle dropped near a rooming house across the street. Inside was a hunting rifle, binoculars, and a radio, all with fingerprints. The FBI quickly traced them to an escaped convict, an outspoken racist named James Earl Ray. A massive international manhunt kicked off. Ray used different aliases to flee to Canada and then to London. For 2 months, he was one of the most wanted men on the planet. Finally, on June 8, 1968, he was arrested at London's Heathrow Airport as he tried to board a flight to white-ruled Rhodesia. Back in the US, Ray's case took a weird turn. To avoid the death penalty, his lawyer advised him to plead guilty. He did, and on March 10, 1969, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. But just 3 days later, Ray took it all back. He claimed he was just a pawn in a bigger conspiracy run by a mysterious guy he only knew as Raoul. He spent the rest of his life insisting he was innocent and trying to get a new trial, but he never succeeded. His claims and all the unanswered questions fueled decades of conspiracy theories. Many people, including members of Dr. King's own family, came to believe that Ray didn't act alone and was maybe a scapegoat for a plot involving the government or the mafia. In 1979, a House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that Ray probably did fire the shot, but likely as part of a small conspiracy, though they couldn't prove who else was involved. Whatever the truth is, the impact of Dr. King's assassination is undeniable. It was a profound national trauma that stole a crucial leader at a critical time. It deepened the cynicism and despair of the late 60s, a time already torn apart by the Vietnam War. The murder was a brutal reminder of the violent resistance to equality and progress. It wasn't just another homicide, it was a devastating blow to the nation's conscience. And it left a void that we can still feel today. Our next case taps into one of our deepest, most primal fears: the fear of the unknown. This isn't a story about a crime that got solved, but about a phantom who terrorized Northern California, played a deadly game with the cops and the press, and then just vanished. He left behind a legacy of fear and a mystery that still haunts us. He gave himself a name that would become infamous: the Zodiac. The Zodiac Killer is officially connected to 5 murders and 2 attempted murders between 1968 and 1969. But he claimed he killed as many as 37 people. His reign of terror started in the quiet lovers' lanes around the San Francisco Bay Area. On December 20th, 1968, 2 high school students, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, were shot and killed. 7 months later, another young couple was shot in a park. The young woman, Darlene Ferrin, died, but her boyfriend, Michael Mageau, survived and was able to describe the attacker. What made this killer different was his chilling, desperate need for attention. On August 1st, 1969, the terror went from just murder to a full-blown media spectacle. 3 local newspapers each got a nearly identical handwritten letter. "Dear editor," they began, "I am the killer of the 2 teenagers, last CHRIST, MASS, ... The letters had details only the killer would know, proving they were real. But there was more. Each letter had part of a 408-symbol cryptogram. The killer demanded the papers publish the cipher on their front pages, or else he'd go on a kill rampage. This was the start of the Zodiac's twisted game. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a showman who craved the spotlight. A week later, a local school teacher and his wife actually cracked the code. The message was rambling and misspelled. "I like killing people because IT is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all." He also chillingly claimed he was collecting slaves for the afterlife. The Zodiac kept attacking, and his methods changed. In September 1969, he approached a couple at a lake wearing a bizarre executioner-style hood with his now famous cross-circle symbol on it. He tied them up and stabbed them, killing the woman, Cecilia Shepard. Then he drove to a payphone and calmly reported the murder to the police himself. His last confirmed murder was his boldest. On October 11, 1969, he got into a cab in San Francisco, had the driver, Paul Stein, drive to a wealthy neighborhood, and then shot him in the head. As police were responding, they actually stopped and questioned a man walking nearby who fit the description, but they let him go. 3 days later, a new letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. "This is the Zodiac speaking," it said. Inside was a piece of Paul Stine's bloody shirt as proof. The letter also boasted that he had talked to the cops right after the murder and mocked them for being incompetent. For years, the letters and ciphers kept coming, taunting police and keeping the public terrified. He threatened to shoot up a school bus. He sent more ciphers, one of which, the 340 cipher, was so complex it was unsolved for 51 years, until a team of amateur sleuths cracked it in 2020. The message was just as disturbing. I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber, because it too will send me to paradise all the sooner. Despite a huge investigation and tons of suspects over the years, the Zodiac's identity has never been confirmed. After a final letter in 1974, he just disappeared. His communication stopped as suddenly as it began. The Zodiac killer's impact was massive. He was the faceless, motiveless terror that defined the era's crime wave. He wasn't your neighbor. He was a boogeyman, a ghost who could be anyone. He showed how one person could hold an entire region hostage with fear and media manipulation. By turning his murders into a public puzzle, he created a myth that has obsessed and horrified people for over 50 years, leaving behind one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. If there is one crime that truly represents the death of the 1960s, the bloody symbolic end to the decade of peace, and love it s, the string of brutal murders committed by the followers of a failed musician and cult leader named Charles Manson. The Tate LaBianca murders in August 1969 weren't just killings. They were a twisted piece of theater, an attack on the establishment that sent a shockwave of paranoia through Los Angeles and the entire country. Charles Manson was a career criminal who'd spent most of his life locked up. When he was released from prison in 1967, he wandered into the hippie scene in San Francisco, with a guitar, a messiah complex, and a scary talent for exploiting people's weaknesses. He gathered a group of young, lost followers who started to see him as a kind of prophet. This group, known as the Manson Family, eventually moved to Spahn Ranch. A rundown old movie set outside of LA there, Manson preached a bizarre doomsday philosophy he pieced together from the Bible, Scientology, and the Beatles' White Album. He became obsessed with the song Helter Skelter, believing it was a prophecy of a coming race war. He thought the family could kickstart this war by committing a series of gruesome murders of rich white people and framing the Black Panthers for them. When the chaos was over, he and his followers would emerge from a bottomless pit in Death Valley to rule the world. In the summer of 1969, Manson decided it was time to unleash Helter Skelter. On the night of August 8th, he sent 4 of his followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, to a house at 10,050 Cielo Drive. The house was being rented by director Roman Polanski and his wife, the 26-year-old actress Sharon Tate, who is 10.5 months pregnant. Manson had been to the house before, trying to get a record deal from the guy who used to live there, and the rejection had fueled his rage against the Hollywood elite. What happened that night was almost unspeakable. The family members first killed an 18-year-old who was just visiting the caretaker. Then they went inside and slaughtered everyone. Sharon Tate, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and her boyfriend Wojciech Frykowski. They were shot and stabbed a total of 102 times. Before they left, Susan Atkins used Sharon Tate's blood to write the word pig on the front door. The very next night, Manson, unhappy with how messy the first killings were, decided to lead the second raid himself. He drove around LA with some of his followers looking for more victims. They chose the home of a wealthy supermarket executive, Leno LaBianca, and his wife, Rosemary. Manson and Watson went in and tied up the couple. Then Manson left, ordering his followers to do the murders. The LaBiancas were stabbed to death. The words "Rise in Death to Pigs" were written in blood on the walls, and Helter Skelter was misspelled on the fridge. For months, Los Angeles was paralyzed with fear. The sheer brutality and randomness of the crimes were terrifying. At first, police didn't connect the 2 murder scenes, and the investigation went nowhere. The break finally came when Susan Atkins, who was in jail on another charge, started bragging to a cellmate about being involved in the murders. The trial that followed was a media circus that horrified the entire country. Manson and his female followers carved X's into their foreheads, sang songs, and giggled in court, showing zero remorse. The prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, had the tough job of proving that Manson, who didn't physically kill anyone at the scenes, was the mastermind. The key was the testimony of Linda Kasabian, who had been a lookout and was granted immunity. She gave a chilling inside account of Manson's control and his helter-skelter motive. In 1971, Manson and his followers were convicted and sentenced to death. Those sentences were changed to life in prison when California briefly outlawed the death penalty in 1972. The Manson murders were a cultural firebomb. They blew up the last remaining shreds of 1960s idealism, twisting the hippie dream of peace and love into a nightmare of violence and manipulation. The image of young, seemingly normal girls turning into remorseless killers under the spell of a charismatic leader was terrifying. The crimes confirmed mainstream America's worst fears about the counterculture, cementing the idea that it was a dark path to murder. More than any other crime of the decade, the Manson murders were the tragic end to an era of innocence. The 1960s were a decade of shocking and violent contradictions. The cases we've talked about today show just how turbulent that time was, and each one left a permanent scar on the country. From quiet streets in Queens to the hills of Hollywood, these crimes revealed the dark anxieties hiding just beneath a surface of progress. They introduced new fears and new kinds of violence that we're still dealing with today. If you found this deep dive into the dark side of the 60s interesting, and you want to explore more historical cases that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. And let us know in the comments which of these cases you find the most chilling, or if there's another crime from this era that you think really defines the decade. When you look back at these top 5 crimes of the 1960s, a really disturbing picture starts to form. This was more than just a spike in violence, it was a major shift in crime itself. The murder of Kitty Genovese in 1964 held up a mirror to a society worried about being disconnected from each other. 2 years later, Charles Wittmann's shooting spree introduced the horror of the random mass shooting, shattering the idea that we were safe in public places. In 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. showed how one politically motivated act of violence could rock the entire nation, exposing the raw, painful fault lines of race and hate. That same year, the Zodiac killer created a new kind of feigned anonymous phantom who taunted everyone and turned murder into a public spectacle. And finally, in 1969, the Manson family murderers served as the decade's brutal finale, twisting the counterculture's promise into a horrifying vision of violence and cult devotion, effectively killing the 60s dream. Together, these 5 cases tell the story of a nation losing its innocence. They fueled a growing sense of fear that would reshape America for decades, leading to new laws, new police tactics, and a deep change in how people thought about their own safety. The 1960s might be remembered for peace and love, but it was also the decade that forced America to look at its own darkness. The question that still hangs over it all is a simple one. Was the peace and love an illusion all along? Or was it a beautiful dream that was just and violently woken up? Thanks for watching.